Hello, mentalists! So today we're discussing the topic of physicalism and materialism. And basically the goal is just to try to understand each of these different positions about what exists. Especially we're interested in what exists in relation to the mind. What sort of a thing is a mind? Physicalism and materialism can both roughly be understood as views that see minds or mental properties as essentially material or physical substances or material or physical properties. Those are all different sorts of ways of understanding these materialist and physicalist claims, and the goal of today will be just to separate them slightly and understand each in a little bit more detail so that we understand what it is that we're committed to if we're committed to physicalism or materialism. And then we'll also discuss what it is that makes physicalism or materialism attractive as a view. What are arguments in favor of physicalism and materialism? This question is important because for most of the semester we'll be looking at arguments against physicalism and materialism. So we'd better have some idea of why we're supporting this view if we're going to go ahead and defend it or look at criticisms of it. We'll need to know the pros and the cons, right? Why is this a good theory to believe in? Why is it a bad theory to believe in? That's kind of one of the main goals of this class. So let's start with how we define materialism and physicalism. The way that Jaegwon Kim, the author of our textbook on philosophy of mind, materialism is kind of the older version of physicalism. Materialism is the claim that everything that exists only materially. There are no non-material objects in existence, something like that. And physicalism is a more contemporary version of materialism on his view. Why? Well, physicalism says that the objects that exist are whatever objects physics describes as existing, more or less. The reason we say physicalism instead of materialism in certain contexts is just that not everything that exists according to physics is a bit of matter, right? Physics also postulates things like fields that exist, for example, gravitational fields. And fields, you might think, aren't material, they're not enmattered in the same way, but we still think of them as compatible with a physicalist worldview on which all of the objects that exist are objects that physicists would include in their final theory of the world. There are many ways of understanding physicalism. Some of them get us into trouble because they commit us to too much, right? So let's look at some precise philosophically minded definitions of physicalism and see if any of those definitions can help us make sense of whatever claim we should be committed to if we are materialists or physicalists. So on the one hand, there are more minimal definitions, which include more things, allow more things to be true or compatible with physicalism, and then more maximal definitions, which make it a more strict claim and it rules out more things. So we'll start with the more minimal definitions. The way we're going to start is with definitions of supervenience. So physicalists are usually understood to be committed to some form of supervenience. Comparatively, supervenience is a relatively weak claim in that some non-physicalists also accept supervenience. But it's a good place to start because, again, we're starting from the more minimal definitions which are compatible with more understandings of the way that physicalism is true and moving to the more maximal definitions. So let's start with this definition of mind-body supervenience. We can summarize this as no mental difference without a physical difference. And how does that go? The mental supervenes on the physical in that things, objects, events, organisms, persons, and so on, that are exactly alike in all physical respects or physical properties cannot differ with respect to mental properties. That is, physical indiscernibility entails psychological indiscernibility. So if you were to put me in a machine that scanned my body and replicated every single one of my physical particles in another place, if I had a machine that could physically replicate me, this first understanding of mind-body supervenience would say that in replicating all of my physical properties, you're also replicating all of my mental properties. So if I accept this form of supervenience, that copy of me would have all of the psychological properties that I have. They would maybe believe in the same things that I believed in. They'd have the same preferences that I have. They might have a tendency to feel the same emotions in the same situations. Why? Well, this definition of supervenience suggests that all of those properties depend on my physical makeup, and if my physical makeup is basically identical, then we should also have the same psychological properties. One important thing to note is this definition of supervenience leaves open the possibility that two things that are alike mentally without being identical physically, for example, a robot duplicate of a flesh person could have the same mental properties on this definition. So this definition only requires that if two things are physically identical, then they are mentally identical as well. It doesn't require that all things that are mentally identical also share all their physical properties. It might be the case that you could be mentally very similar, but be made of different things, according to this definition. So this definition so far allows that you might be able to create a robot functional replica of me. And if you thought that a functional replica also had the same psychological properties, then it would be possible for me and the robot to have the same mental properties without having the same physical properties. That's okay on this definition. But it's not okay if you copy my physical properties exactly, that other person have different psychological states. So moving now into more maximalist definitions, toward more strong definitions, we can call this next version of supervenience, which is one thing physicalists have to be committed to, some kind of supervenience. We can call this kind of supervenience strong supervenience. This definition says, the mental supervenes on the physical in that if anything X has mental property M, there is a physical property P such that X has P, and necessarily any object that has P has M. So note first of all that this definition, being more strict, it entails the first definition of supervenience. So it says everything the first definition says, plus a couple of other things. And the other things that it says is basically it establishes this necessitation condition. There is some physical property that necessitates having a particular mental property. For example, having a particular neural arrangement may in every instance instantiate pain. So what this definition is doing is it's picking out a specific mental property. For example, pain is a mental property. It's saying for any pain, there is a physical property such that something has that physical property, like a brain state. Necessarily, that thing also has pain. So it's saying that there is some such physical state that necessitates that mental state. So we're starting to get sort of types put into this equation now. Now it becomes the case that there's a type of physical state you can be in that always necessitates a type of mental state, more or less. But it's put in property language. So necessarily some physical properties produce certain mental properties. It's no longer about sort of scanning the individual object and saying if the individual object is identical all the way through. Now it's about saying there's a specific physical property that an object might have in addition to other properties. And if you were to replicate just that property, you'd be able to replicate the mental property as well. Here's a final and maximalist understanding of supervenience. Call this global supervenience. So now we're not looking at like physical properties or physical entities understood at the individual level anymore. We're looking at the entire world, at the entire universe. This supervenience claim says the mental supervenes on the physical in that worlds, entire universes that are alike in all physical respects are alike in all mental respects as well. In fact, worlds that are physically alike are exactly alike mentally, are exactly alike overall. So if you were to take this universe that we all live in and make an exact physical copy, this supervenience claim says you'd basically be copying everything. You're not leaving anything out. And not only that, as a matter of fact, but there's nothing else that's added in to the other world when you copy it. So if you only take all the physical properties, you're actually, as a matter of fact, when you copy the world, taking all of the properties. So basically this says that like if you're God and you're making the universe, once you've made all of the physical things in the universe, you've made everything that is in the universe at the moment. You don't need to add anything else. There aren't any ghosts that you need to sprinkle in at the end or any other mysterious like pixie dust. Once you've made the physical things, everything that we see in the world, everything that currently is in the world would be there in that world as well. All right, so each of those were our three supervenience claims, which I like to think of as a kind of covariation. So if you have a physical property, then you get a mental property, and they're strongly linked in some way. This next claim is an even stronger claim than that, and some physicalists think that you need to have at least this claim to be a genuine physicalist. And this claim is called mind-body dependence, and it goes something like this. The mental properties a given thing has depend on and are determined by the physical properties it has. So the important claim here is the dependence, the determined by. That is, our psychological character is wholly determined by our physical nature. Our physical nature says everything there is to say about what psychological character we have. It's a stronger claim still than supervenience because it establishes the idea that somehow the physical has kind of a metaphysical primacy on the world. It says the physical comes first and it generates or necessitates the mental. The mental comes in sort of second hand. So the mental depends on the physical. The physical is more primal, more primary in the universe. So we can define physicalism either in reference to one of these four claims, one of the supervenience claims, maybe that's what we're understanding. Some people call these claims minimal physicalism. Some people have pointed out these claims are compatible with non-physicalist assumptions, and so maybe they don't count as sufficient for physicalism. And now we also have a definition of physicalism which goes in maybe more early modern terminology, and call this substance physicalism. Substance physicalism says that all that exists in the world are bits of matter in space-time and aggregate structures composed of bits of matter, and there's nothing else in the space-time world. That's another way of putting what the materialist claim is. Notice that it doesn't say anything about minds. It just says that everything that exists is a physical thing. And this is maybe the most basic understanding of physicalism you could have. The other definitions are there for various purposes, which we may or may not put them to later in the semester. Hopefully, though, you can see how these assumptions are graded from more minimal to more maximal. That substance physicalist claim is, in a sense, more absolutist than the very first supervenience claim that we made, which is actually a little bit weaker. It's compatible with many things being true about the universe. All right, so now that we've gotten clear on materialism on the one hand and physicalism on the other hand in sort of different claims that you could be committed to if you're a physicalist, we need to get clear on what different kinds of physicalism there might be. And these are kinds of physicalism that we'll encounter examples of as we go through our class. And the main two kinds of physicalism that I want us to separate, to distinguish for now, are non-reductive physicalism and reductive physicalism. So let's start with reductive physicalism, because that might be the easiest one to understand at first glance. So reductive physicalism says that psychological properties or kinds or types of psychological things are reducible to physical properties or kinds or types of things. That is, psychological properties and kinds are physical properties and kinds. They're the same. There are only properties of one sort exemplified in the world, and they are physical properties. So you can use the terminology of mental to describe certain things, but in reality, you're actually describing physical things. There's just a different way of talking. There's not a deep difference. And one thing that's important in understanding this claim is understanding the concept of reduction. So reduction we can think of as trying to explain the objects or terms or laws of one scientific level of explanation, if you will, like for example the psychological level of explanation, using the objects or terms or laws of a different level of scientific explanation, usually a lower or more fundamental level of explanation. That's the order in which you tend to go with reduction. So for example, psychoneural identity theory is a claim that the mind is the brain, so that all mental properties are neural properties. And that is a claim that attempts to reduce the terms or the objects of psychology to neuroscience, to the objects or terms of neuroscience, to explain, if you will, psychology in terms of neuroscience, or to explain all psychological laws using neuroscientific laws. Reductive physicalism is a kind of physicalism that's committed to claims like that, that's committed to claims that you can reduce, explain psychological terms in terms of physical terms. Terms like neuroscientific terms, biochemical terms, and other things like that. But basically they've got to be purely physical things on that side of the translation. For a claim like this, we might need bridge principles that connect one level of causal explanation to another level of explanation. We might need to say how it is that we translate the mental properties into the physical properties. And these laws will tell us how explanations or objects or terms or laws are related. For example, you would have to have a theory like a particular subject is in pain only if or only when their C fibers are activated. That's probably not true, that particular claim that I made, but that's just an example. So you'd need to specify what sort of neurological states would constitute being in a particular psychological state, like pain. And you'd have to have laws that connected that type of state to that type of physical state all the way down, right? For every single type of mental state or mental process, you'd need to specify how it is realized in physical language. So that's reductive physicalism. There's also a physicalist claim called non-reductive physicalism. It's sometimes also referred to as property dualism. And that term, property dualism, will start to tell you how this works. So non-reductive physicalism says there are two types of properties in the world, but only one kind of substance. So everything that exists is a physical substance, but objects can have at least two types of properties. There are physical properties on the one hand and mental properties on the other. And the mental properties cannot be reduced to the physical properties. So the psychological properties or the mental properties of a system are distinct from or are irreducible to the physical properties. So non-reductive physicalism is the endorsement of physicalism, but without the endorsement of reduction of psychological terms into physical terms, or the refusal to reduce psychological properties into physical properties. So non-reductionism in general is resisting the reduction of objects or terms or laws of one science into objects or terms or laws of another science. For example, if you were an economic non-reductionist, you might say that economic laws can't be explained purely in terms of laws of psychology. So economic behavior can't be fully explained by psychological behavior. There's some other feature of the economic behavior being collective or something like that that means that it can't be explained in terms of individualistic psychology. And many economists might subscribe to that idea. Similarly, you might get psychologists saying that while it can be informative to study brains and to get information from neuroscience, you can't reduce psychological properties to neuroscientific properties because there's some sort of special thing about the psychological properties, some special explanation that psychological science allows you to give that neurological science won't allow you to give, for example. Or you could say that for cognitive science or some other science of mind. Anybody who's a non-reductive physicalist thinks there's something that separates the psychological properties from the physical properties, without this meaning that we don't live in a materialist or a physicalist universe overall. As we'll see, the challenge here is specifying how that non-reduction works without undermining physicalism. One broad question we might be interested in asking is why we might want or not want reductions, beyond like the specific issues that will come up later in the semester. One reason why we might want reductions is that it might help us move toward a unified science. If I can reduce all psychological terms into physical terms, that means that all of the sciences will eventually be one science, which is really good because then we'll have one theory of everything. Some people really want that. Some philosophers also think that the reduction offers some explanatory benefits. Consider how it can be helpful, for example, for chemists to recognize how physical laws restrict or determine chemical laws, because they're basically the same. That there's some sense in which you could interchange the laws, you could explain the laws in terms of each other, and that's something that we're trying to do. Chemists want to know what the relationship is between the chemical properties and the physical properties of an object.
See all the energy that's given off? And the energy's given off because the electrons are recombining with other electrons, making a chemical reaction.
It can be hard to do that in certain cases, but it's very helpful when you can find those bridge laws. And it's helpful for science, right? It's helpful for explanation. It's helpful for technology. The thought is, if we could reduce psychological terms to other physical, non-psychological terms, we'd be able to make some advancements in our scientific understanding.
Now that's a chemical reaction.
One reason to resist reductionism, though, is that there might be unexpected explanatory or ontological costs to resisting reduction. For example, some people think non-reduction of the mental might necessitate eliminativism about the mental. There are also people, of course, who think reducing the mental also produces eliminativism about the mental. So it depends on how you're minded whether this is a serious charge for reductionism or non-reductionism. Another reason is that there may be no plausible reduction base. There might be nothing that you can use to correspond to each and every one of the psychological processes or psychological states that you want to reduce. For example, as in economics, there is no way to specify the set of things that make it be the case that the economic stuff is true, such that you get a consistent set of bridge laws. There's kind of a fuzzy boundary to any economic thing that happens, describing it always in terms of the same stuff that's happening at the individual psychological level of the actors in the market, for example. A further reason is that reduction may get in the way of methodological commitments or ontological commitments that we might have. So some people think that in order to be able to do reductions of the psychological into the physical or into behavioral terms, for example, you'll just need to say you have psychological state of pain if you're either in this brain state or 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 in this state of silicone connections or in this electronic state or in this electronic state. Basically, you could give a complete description, but you need to put all of the physical states that would make the pain state into a giant disjunction, and that looks really unnatural and unattractive. And someone like Fodor thinks that natural laws don't look like that. They don't look like a bunch of disjunctions. They don't look like a really long this or 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 this. They are all. Finally, one might resist reduction in virtue of some consideration like multiple realizability. The term multiple realizability refers to how some people think that certain mental states or mental processes can be realized by many different types of materials. So if you think that it might be possible for intelligent computers, artificially intelligent computers, to understand language, for example, if you think understanding is a psychological state, then you think that understanding can be realized by both an electronic system like a computer and by a biological system like a human. And so if you think that's true, then you think understanding is multiply realizable. There's more than one physical object that can produce it. You might think a similar thing about fear, right? You might think lots of different creatures can feel fear even if they're composed very differently from each other. If you think like that, then you're a proponent of multiple realizability, and multiple realizability is a reason to be a non-reductive physicalist, at least, because if you were a reductive physicalist, you'd have to specify an intimate connection between any mental state and a particular physical state that realized it. So you wouldn't want to say that the robot, computer, artificial intelligence had the same understanding of language that I did. You'd want to say it has something that's analogous to understanding, but it's not understanding, if you were a reductive physicalist. We'll talk about that issue of multiple realizability more in the weeks that are coming up. So now that all those definitions are out of the way, what are some reasons for believing that physicalism is true? We've talked about some different conceptions of physicalism, but why adopt any of these versions of physicalism? Why not be a dualist, for example? Well, I'll give you a couple of arguments, and we can talk during class about how effective you think these are. So take some time after you listen to this lecture and think about which of these premises you agree with or which you disagree with, which you think are the weakest premises and the easiest to attack, even if you do agree with them. Because that'll be important to figuring out whether we have good reasons right now to believe in physicalism. On the one hand, we might think we want good reasons to believe in physicalism because it's a very popular view. We want as many people to believe it as possible. And if we want that, then we need to make sure the arguments are good. But if the arguments are bad, there's sort of two options. Either we say, oh, physicalism isn't that good of view in the first place, or we say, oh man, we need to come up with better arguments in favor of physicalism because it still seems to make a lot of sense, but these arguments aren't the way to get people to make sure to subscribe to physicalism. Okay, so here's our first argument. It's the argument from causal closure. Premise 1. Every event which has a cause has a physical cause. You can call this the causal closure principle. So basically it's saying anytime anything happens in the universe, it's happening because of a physical thing made it happen. Premise 2 says mental events cause physical events. To give you an example, if I feel hungry, I will go out and seek out a sandwich or an apple or something to eat. So mental events cause physical events. That seems true. Premise 3. If an event, call it event 1, causes another event, call it event 2, then there is no event, call it event hash, such that event hash is non-supervenient on event 1 and causes event 2. That's the exclusion principle. So basically, if my brain state that corresponds to hunger causes my reaching for a sandwich, then there's no further event such that that event is not supervenient on my brain state of being hungry, and that other event also causes my reaching for the sandwich. That is, there's only one event that fully explains my reaching for the sandwich, and it's the physical event. So the conclusion is mental events are supervenient on physical events. That is, physicalism is true. So any event that I'm going to find that isn't the brain state can only cause my reaching for the sandwich if it's supervenient on the brain state. So physicalism has to be true. The core idea behind the argument from causal closure is just that if anything happens in the universe, it happens for physical reasons. And why does it happen for physical reasons? Well, if I'm a physicalist, I think that everything in the world is physical. So everything in the world should be explained only by physical causes. That's basically it. Therefore, if anything that looks like a non-physical event happens or happens to cause something, such as my hunger, then it must actually be minimally supervenient on a physical event. Think back to Elizabeth of Bohemia's objection to Descartes. Elizabeth's worry is basically this argument. It's hard to understand how anything non-physical could cause physical things to happen. How would those two things even interact? Physical things are located in space and they've got physical properties. How would something that's not located in space and doesn't have physical properties cause anything unless it was at least supervenient on something that was physical? So for now, I'll give you two reasons why you might reject this argument so that you think about it a little bit more. And then we'll talk about a second argument that I want to present that favors physicalism. So one reason to resist this argument is maybe you don't like the exclusion principle. So maybe you think that certain events are overdetermined and you have, for certain events, two causes that explain why that event happened, and had one failed, the other one would have worked. So maybe you are a dualist and you think that the hunger by itself could have caused the reaching without the neural state. Or the neural state by itself could have caused my reaching for the sandwich without the hunger. It just so happens that both happen at the same time. And so our hunger does cause our reaching for the sandwich, but it's not because every physical event has a physical cause. Sometimes physical events have non-physical causes. That might be a counter-argument. Another reason to resist this argument, maybe if you're not a physicalist, is to reject causal closure altogether. Perhaps causation has no causal role in the world after all, right? Maybe you're a Humean and you doubt that causation is even a real thing. Because how do you even know about causation? It's through induction, and we can't prove that induction works. So maybe there is no causation in the world. If there is no causation in the world, there's no reason to accept causal closure. Or another way to reject causal closure would be to argue that not all causation is physical causation. That might be hard to show, but that's a view you could have. Someone like Descartes might want to have a view like that, for example. Now we come to our second argument in favor of physicalism. Why believe physicalism? This argument is called the argument from methodological naturalism. You might remember from an earlier lecture that I talked about what naturalism is. So this argument is sort of starting from that standpoint. Premise 1. It is rational to be guided in one's metaphysical commitments by the methods of natural science. A lot of us accept that, right? We like to follow what scientists believe. We think that that's a good thing to do. We think that gives us reliable information. We think scientists are usually honest in their investigation of the world, and so that makes them good sources of information. We think their methodologies are really careful. They want to know the truth, so on and so forth. So basically, premise 1 says it's rational to be guided by what scientists say. Premise 2 says the metaphysical picture of the world that one is led to by the methods of natural science is physicalism. So if you follow what scientists say, you'll come up with a physicalist picture of the universe. That's what premise 2 says. Conclusion: it's rational to believe physicalism. One way to put this argument is scientists tend to say physicalism is true, and it's good to believe scientists, so we should think physicalism is true.
Pretty cool.
Now, how would you respond to this argument if you were an anti-physicalist? One way to respond to this argument is to reject the methodological commitment in the first place. Maybe you don't think that naturalism is a plausible way to explore the universe. If you're really into reading tarot cards or following astrological predictions, if you're really into crystal healing, maybe methodological naturalism is not so attractive to you because sometimes you think natural science misses truths in the universe or something like that. Maybe that's a reason not to follow methodological naturalism. However, for a lot of people, that's not a very attractive view. Even many people who believe in alternative healing, for example, think that natural science is really good and it's a good method, and it's just that a lot of scientists have blind spots or something like that, or there's already a dualist commitment that means that you reject methodological naturalism from the first place. So you're rejecting the conclusion because you've already accepted a different one. In a way, you think that that premise is false already. One reason to still keep that premise is that naturalism just seems very plausible. It seems plausible that science will continue progressing because the method that scientists use to get information in their different disciplines tends to be reliable, and we do seem to be increasing our knowledge base. So why not think that we should be optimistic and that naturalism will get us true information going forward as well? Another way to resist this argument is to reject the second premise. The premise that the metaphysical picture that scientists tell us about is physicalism. Some people think that actually the natural scientific picture is still very incomplete. There's so many things we don't know yet. It might be too early to conclude that the picture we're being led to is physicalism. And we'll see some arguments later in this semester that reinforce this approach. Also, it's possible, maybe you know some scientists, some people who do science and who follow the methods of natural science, but aren't convinced that the world is a physical world. There are scientists in the world who believe in dualism, for example, or some other metaphysical claim, like idealism or solipsism or even nihilism. Those scientists exist. And presumably they are people who are following the methods of natural science. So maybe it's not obvious that this premise is true. Maybe it's not obvious that the methods of natural science always lead to physicalism. Maybe overall that's true, but these exceptions sort of give room for someone who objects to this argument to kind of dig in, right? One question you might ask, though, is if you reject premise 2, then what is the alternative? What's the alternative picture other than following whatever natural science says is true? Even those natural scientists who at the moment might believe in dualism, maybe you think eventually once we complete science, they won't end up being able to be committed to dualism, but because there's still so many unanswered questions, there's still room for that, but I don't think that that will be true in the future. But now your argument isn't so much based on your logical commitments or your methodological commitments, it's really just based on your optimism about a particular paradigm working out, right? And that might be the biggest problem for this argument, is that there's a way of understanding the argument where it's wishful thinking and not grounded as firmly in a deductive argument as we might prefer. But maybe I'm being really unfair. Is that an unfair way to put this argument from methodological naturalism? What do you think? What's another way to defend physicalism as a claim? It does seem like a really important claim to keep, and it does seem like it has a lot of explanatory power. So we should try to find an argument that's very strong in defense of physicalism. Okay, so that's probably more than enough material for today. So just in summary, we covered different ways of understanding commitments that are made by physicalists. And then in the second half of today's lecture, we talked through a couple of arguments in favor of physicalism. What are reasons to believe physicalism is true? And I also tried to sketch some reasons why people resist these arguments before we get into the level of detail that we'll get into later when we come up to objections to physicalism. So what do you think? Do we have good reasons to believe physicalism? If we should believe physicalism, what is the best formulation of physicalism in your view, and why is that? That might take some time to think through, but it's an important question, and thankfully we still have a couple more months to ask those questions. So thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time.